Thanks for joining us for the Long Island Sound Podcast. Each week we explore new music and dive deeper with the artists and their stories behind the music. Please subscribe and rate and review us wherever you stream this podcast. Here's your host, Steve Yusko.
Hey, this is what you can expect. In today's special episode, I have a guest host hosting the program, a really wonderful guy. More importantly, he brought a fantastic guest. And this is a man who is extremely successful, who supports live music here on Long Island and building community. He has a phenomenal backstory, and I think you're going to find it really interesting. Check it out. You know, I've been thinking we've got a wellspring of talent here on Long Island. I am truly amazed at everyone that I meet here on the Long Island Sound. But where would we be without the venues that support live music and original live music? I have a special guest host. He's been on the podcast as a guest before. He's a producer, a drummer extraordinaire. His name is Chris Marshak. He has a very special guest here today. I'm going to leave that a mystery as I turn over the microphone to a really wonderful guy. Welcome to the podcast, Chris. Good to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Steve. So good to be here. This is my maiden voyage as a podcast host. But I can tell you this, I'm someone who is extremely interested in the process of things. I think both in music and in life. When people have an idea, whether it's a musical one or an entrepreneurial one, and taking that idea and having the courage to actualize it, that's something I connect with, that interests me. And inevitably, there are always obstacles to overcome, and failure is always a part of the process. People see an end product or a business, and they can mistakenly assume that it came out of the womb that way, not realizing the painstaking process that was involved. I like looking at success stories and tracing them back to their inception. And speaking of success stories, today I'm going to talk to Mark Burford. Mark is a founder and brewmaster emeritus of the Blue Point Brewing Company. Blue Point Brewery was the first microbrewery on Long Island. It was established in 1998 in a shipyard on River Avenue in Patchogue, New York. Prior to that, Mark was an avid home brewer. After growing the brand for 16 years, Blue Point was sold to Anheuser-Busch for nearly $20 million in 2014, reportedly. Mark's success has been well documented. He has been interviewed by Forbes magazine, the New York Times, Bloomberg, Newsday, as well as many other media outlets and publications. Mark is one of the most respected brewmasters in the world. Recently, in 2023, Anheuser-Busch sold Blue Point Brewing to Tilray Brands as part of a huge deal that included 8 beer and beverage brands. All of this is very impressive, and we could easily devote the entire podcast to it. That being said, what I'd like to focus on today is something a little different. Mark's love of music and his advocacy for the Long Island music community. Welcome to the Long Island Sound Podcast, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, good. We're glad to have you here. Now, from Blue Point's inception, music has always been a huge part of the Blue Point community. And as you guys have grown, so has the stage you have given to musicians, both locally and nationally. How did the idea of combining craft brewing with supporting local music come about? Where was the origin of that?
Well, I think it really is truthfully part of what we just wanted to do. It was really, that was the genius of it, was just that we were the test subjects and we wanted to do what we wanted to do. And we found ourselves with a venue or a place that we could convince people was a venue. I think that's a better way to put it. And it was a unique space, and a lot of things have to come together to make things happen. And the music that we put on in the early days at River Avenue inside the brewery before we had filled the building up with the brewing equipment, those kind of things could never happen today because there are too many rules and regulations. And Patchogue is in a much better place than it was back then. And one of the advantages of being in a town that's not at its best is they often overlook the finer points of regulation in order to let business thrive. And now Blue Point, we took advantage of that by having music inside the brewery, so forth, and it created a very unique atmosphere and a unique venue for both the people who played there, the artists, and the people that came for the shows. But really, it was part of a lifestyle, right? The whole thing, the beer and the music was part of our lifestyle. I traveled around and followed bands, and that it was a lot easier to bring the bands to us than go after them after a while. So, but also showcasing original music was a big piece of what we really wanted to do, because that's the hard piece on the venue side, and creating the trust with our consumer that no matter what we put on, they were going to come and see it because they knew we had at least some modicum of idea of what we were putting on. So it was never going to be pop star stuff. It was always going to be music where the players were central. And depending on the style, it could be bluegrass, it could be blues, it could be rock, it could be all kinds of things. Uh, it could be Turkish music at the Cast Fest. It could be very unusual things that we expose people to. But it was part of going on the journey with the beer and going on the journey with the music. As we all know, that's really where it started and how we got going.
Yeah. And you mentioned original music, and I think that's, when we live in Long Island, there's a ton of cover bands, and it's certainly that seems to be the most popular form of entertainment for a lot of folks. But you guys have always been aligned with original music, and that's something that I've always noticed, and I think is beautiful, quite frankly. Do you think, in terms of you creating your own beer, let's just say most people go to the store and they buy a beer that's already made. You made an original beer if you compare it to music, Do you think your vision of creating an original beer and also being an advocate of people creating original music are in any way connected?
Well, I think it can't not be, right, in a way. It's that sort of that intellectual curiosity journey, right? And so you always want it to be something new. Now, I understand there's cover bands, and that's a valid way to exist and so forth, but it wasn't pertinent to us, right? It was the original music was what was pertinent. To your point, we were creators, and so for that we appreciate creators, and that it was almost that those moments with the original music when you're exposing people to it, and or people coming for something they know. That to me is the connection and the magical thing that we were trying to do, was that piece of it. And that was the part that wasn't as readily available on Long Island at the time. And still, it still has its struggles and moments to get seen. And I think that's where we were bringing something different, right? In reality, it was a point of differentiation for us to be able to put that on. So I think, to your point, I think that was all part of our sort of psyche, and so it ended up being the way it was. But I would much rather do that any day than put on a cover band, which, like I said, is fine and everything. And occasionally we do that too, every once in a while. But in general, that's not the point.
Right, which and again, being a musician myself, people making a living, people have to make a living. But the places that actually support original music they've certainly dwindled as I seem to get older. And to me, what you've created and what Blue Point's created is really an oasis. To me, it's a rare thing. I had seen a previous interview of you from a while back, and you talked about going around in your station wagon, before craft beers were accepted by everybody, and you kind of had to sell it to people. And then eventually, it became on the map, and places had to know about it because it was coming from the customers were asking about it. So, but your initial, the way you describe it, I think, to me, is similar to a lot of bands or artists when nobody knows about them, trying to get people to listen to their music, and especially if it's a little different, So I think that, your connection, your support of that, and the originalness of you creating this brand, I think, to me, it was something I had always noticed, And so I know the local music community, especially the musicians I play with, are very grateful for the haven you've created for folks there. So you should know that. The other thing, which I want, as far as the music schedule at Blue Point, for people listening, you guys have a pretty extensive live music thing going on there. Could you tell folks a little bit about, like, I know you have special events, which we could talk about, but like a typical week, what's the live music scene like at Blue Point? Like, how many nights a week do you have music? And, you know.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so in the place as it exists today, there's weekly live music Thursday to Sunday. Always check the schedule because there's chances that there's changes or special events and stuff. But basically, we have usually a couple of bands and a couple of solo artists play each week, right? So think Thursday night, the slower nights is going to be solo artists, and Friday, Saturday bands. Now DJs and bands come in and different kinds of acts, but that's week in, week out. And Michelle Wilkins, who runs the pub there, is the sort of the director of that, and deals with a lot of that on the day-to-day business, on the day-to-day action. And we appreciate her for that. And she's also somebody that has a love for the music as well. And so that, to me, it's in great hands for her. I never in one iota would I think about, sort of editing her her deal. But yeah, it's there, and it's there all the time. And one of the interesting things is people that show up to the brewery that don't know that, but want to come to the brewery for whatever reason, the beer or whatnot, and then they get to see the live music. And a lot of times, all of a sudden, you see them staying, and then instead of going home, they're there, and it's always something that we're exposing people to. And the brewery has a couple different big spaces in it, whether it's outside in the beer garden or in the regular bar space that's not the live music room. So people can move around if they want to, but we see a lot of people get attracted to the live music when it's happening.
Yeah, and there's the thing I noticed about the sense of community there. Bands coming to see other bands, and just because of I think you've created a community. It's funny, when I was talking to some folks about asking them who've known you for a while, the one comparison that kept coming up was that a few people described you and Bluepoint similar to a reef. That said they said that you've created an ecosystem in the local community, and just as a reef provides a habitat for various marine organisms, Bluepoint has fostered a mutually beneficial environment where all members of the community and businesses, and especially musicians, have benefited from your success. What are your thoughts on that comparison, as far as like a community and a reef, and any thoughts?
I kind of like it because of I do a lot of work with freshwater advocacy, so that sort of strikes home for me. But I think it's right in that you can only, we don't control the musicians, right? And we never ever did, and never asked them to act a certain way or play a certain way. But creating the space for that all to happen that's a Long Island thing that's hard to do, right? In any geographical area where the real estate is challenging, expensive, you don't usually have the ability to have space and let bands play. Usually every square foot in the restaurant business has to be accounted for and generates X amount of income. We're lucky in our model that we built that we don't have to, we sort of do it a different way, right? And we're lucky that enough people come that allows us to flourish. But yeah, I think from the music and just all the community aspects that we do, whether it's a million different items. Well, it's doggy adoption to Cash Fest tomorrow with 3,000 people in the parking lot, right? Very different types of events that couldn't be further apart, but they're all part of the ecosystem, and they're all play a role. None of them are expendable in our minds.
Right. And it's funny, I also, in one of the early interviews, I heard someone ask you, this was, I don't know, maybe it was a while ago, asking you to pick your favorite venue or something in the Patchogue community. And your answer was so like, it wouldn't be fair for me to say. And you were emphasizing community back then, and you were a younger version of yourself. But it seemed very clear, right? It was so crystal clear in the way you were speaking, how you valued community. And I could tell you, as a musician who's played with various bands, and we've done some work together, obviously, that's something that I think is to be commended, because it's that community. Sometimes in the music business, it's a lot of individuals working, but there's not necessarily this cohesiveness. Now, someone did mention what's Blue Point's role and your role in the Alive After Five. Tell us about that, the evolution of that.
Sure, that it certainly changed over the years. So in the beginning, Patchogue was still in a difficult place downtown, and I got together with the person who was head of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, and we came up with this idea to sort of brainstorm this idea. And I'd seen it at other places around the country where they put the bands on Main Street, and
Mm-hmm.
they might be a street fair, it might be some other thing. And we came up with this idea that we could anchor the street with one end of the main street where the Brick House Brewery was, and then we would be the mobile end at the other end where the bank is, where it's now
Yeah.
Capital One, used to be Norfolk. And so we would build a stage down there, and they would let people flow on Main Street back and forth. And it would, the idea was to bring people to town to expose Patchogue and to enjoy live music on both sides of the town. So we did it, and back in the early days, we used to do it every other week. So there was 10 or 12 in the summertime that we did, and we'd get a bouncy house so the kids could go in there and the parents could stand around and have beers and listen to the live music. But the people could walk back and forth on the street freely back then, slightly different than as it became a massive success and 20,000 people started showing up. Then you got to pen people off, and there's all the issues that happen when you have crowds of that size. And so has become a fantastic success story for Patchogue. They do it 4 times a year now, and we because are now located right in the village, we more or less play a sponsorship role now as opposed to being architects of it and really part and parcel of it for many years.
It's such a great thing. And when someone told me that, I kind of came to the local scene a little bit later than some folks. So learning about that, I wasn't surprised by it, but it was something good to know. Tell me about your earliest musical influences, because you're such a music fan. I know we've had some conversations just even recently, and you could just tell your enthusiasm exudes when you're talking about music. So yeah, tell some folks, like, where did the music bug for you start? Was there any particular artists or movement that went on that got you excited about it?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a house of not musicians, but we had a record player and we had some Beatles records and we listened to that. And my older brother, listened to rock and roll, and I listened to a lot of that growing up. But I think, to be honest, other than the natural attraction to it, I think that when I started to see live shows is when it really kicked in for me. And back in the 70s, the sort of the temple of rock and roll worship was Madison Square Garden back then, with all the big bands that we all know, whether it's Zeppelin, Floyd, and Jethro Tull and Queen, and Black Sabbath, and it goes on forever. I saw a show at the Garden once where Van Halen opened for Black Sabbath before anybody knew who Van
Really?
Halen was. So that was rock and roll. And so as a teenager, it's hard. You see Van Halen open for Black Sabbath, you can't help but be impressed by what's going on there. That's an amazing moment. But one of the things that really struck me, a couple of shows really struck me, right? I think my first show was Kiss at Nassau Coliseum, right? And so I was a kid, and it was fire and brimstone and rock and roll and simplicity and the whole thing. Very exciting. And then my next show, 1977, I saw Pink Floyd at the Garden, right? And so that was the polar opposite of what I had just seen. And that I just said, well, there's something going on here in this world I have to know about. And then after seeing all the bands that you name, all the big bands, got to see the Grateful Dead a few times, and that struck me as something that really struck me, put it that way. And then and by doing that sort of research, one of the things I'd always done, junior high school and high school, I was always the guy that got on the train and went to the Garden and skipped out of school and got the tickets from my friends. And I was the person that would buy a 62 blues record and say, hey, this lick is, Jimmy Page uses this lick, 5 years later. And I would play that for my friends to, varying degrees of interest on their part. But that kind of thing I was just into that for whatever reason. So the historical context of where all the bands came from For some reason that interests me, and I always liked listening to the older music to see the evolution in the path that it took to get to each place. And the Grateful Dead is one of those bands that has so many splinters and ways that you can go when you research all the different interests that the band come from. That it's a really vast and interesting world to get lost in. And so that sort of coming out of the '70s with all of that was sort of, I think, gave me enough fodder to just go on and the ability to go follow anything down the line. Right, the live music wasn't just rock and roll; it was everything. And whether I'm going to see Miles Davis or I'm going to see somebody else, it was always that interest that there's going to be more here. There's going to be the excitement of the moment, right? To show the excitement of the moment. But it moves me. I'll be honest. It's my church personally. People don't want to offend anybody, but it's my church, and it's what I get, where I
Amen.
connect spiritually some other way. And so for me, it'll never end. It's a journey forever, and I'm glad I'm on it.
Excellent. All right. On that note, we're going to just take a short pause here. We'll be right back with the Long Island Sound Podcast.
Are you ready for the ultimate podcasting adventure? The Long Island Sound Podcast offers you not one, but 2 ways to engage with our captivating content. Tune in to our audio podcast on your favorite platform and let your imagination paint vivid pictures of Long Island stories. Or if you're craving a visual feast, catch our video podcast on Spotify and on the Long Island Sound YouTube channel. Double the options, double the excitement.
Mark, you mentioned the Grateful Dead. And in preparing for talking to you today, I talked to a few folks, and there was a rumor that someone told me that you owned every bootleg of the Grateful Dead that they had ever released up until a certain point, and that you have a special listening room in your home, or it did at one point. Is there any truth to this?
Anything that gets passion can verge on fanaticism. It's a fine line, and perhaps I didn't have everything, but certainly plenty. And yeah, the music listening room has changed over the years, and it's gotten more digital in the modern age. And that's an interesting thing because it's so easy to get stuff now. But yeah, it was, I followed them around, I saw them all over the country. I used to scuba dive with Jerry Garcia in Hawaii when I lived out that way. And, so it was a lot of connection, right? And it was fun to meet them all and just see, how to humanize the whole thing. Because when you see people on a big stage and stuff that you read in the press, especially a long time ago, where it was really hard to get information. There were a few music magazines, a few, you read the liner notes 1,000 times on the albums you got, but it was hard to really understand. And so when you started meeting people, I was like, this is the human part of it, right? These people have to travel around, get up in the morning and go to another hotel and play and come out on stage, and you want them to be their best at that moment. You've spent your money, you're showing up. You want them to be their best at every time. And that's hard. That is hard for human beings to do. I give anybody who travels around and does an act, I give them a lot of credit. To pull it together and get out there and do that at night after night, irregardless of what's going on in your life or whatever heck might have happened. And so with meeting all the guys, and they're all different characters, it was great because I felt like I appreciated them enough that I hadn't wasted all my time liking these guys. You know what I mean? If you meet them, there's that thing, don't ever meet your heroes. I was just like, if I met them and they were real assholes, I would have been like, oh man, what the hell am I doing?
But not ask about what it was like to go scuba diving with Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, it was a trip. I'm gonna be very honest. I was living in Hawaii, and we had a mutual friend who, well, it's a good story. The story of how we met's a good one. So on the Big Island of Hawaii, Jerry had done some scuba diving, and I had a mutual friend who was the guy who did the anchor for the NBC News. And so Hawaii is such a small market that the anchors actually go out there and do newscasts. So my buddy was over on the Big Island, and he was at a land use meeting, which is about the most boring thing in the world. It's just at Kona High School, and it's just this real, they're just dealing with whatever local items they had to do. But one of the things on the agenda, one of the things on the agenda was they had there was so much interest in the reef diving that the boats were throwing over their anchors and busting up the reef. So they wanted to drill these pins in because the water's crystal clear, and you put loops, and the people could dive down and hook their boats on and try to save the reef. And so there's, a bunch of local Hawaiian guys up on the dais, and there's folding chairs, and my buddy's asleep in the back with the cameraman. And all of a sudden they say, does anybody have any idea how we could pay for this? And the arm goes up, and it's fucking Jerry, right? So the guy calls on him. Now, the guy in the dais doesn't know who he is, and he calls on him, and Jerry says, I have a band over in the mainland, and we could come over and play, and we'll give the money, and it should pay for the whole thing. And the guy says to Jerry, sir, do you really think anybody's going to come? And Jerry says, I'm pretty sure they'll show up, And so my friend, of course, jumps out of his seat, is like, holy shit. And he interviews him, right? So this is before cell phone, so he can't call me at that moment. So I tune in, 6 o'clock news, see what my buddy's up to. And it says Jerry Garcia, tourist, and my buddy's talking to him, right? So at that time, the only way we sort of communicated out of, I think it was out of Stanford, there was a dead intranet. So I could get on in the 80s and sort of send emails to people. You had to pay, right? It wasn't cheap, but we could do it. So I'm like on the internet sending them messages, what the hell's going on? And, it gets back, he gets, get on a plane, because it's only a 20-minute flight. He goes, come over tomorrow. And I'm like, I'm there. So we flew over, and literally we drove up to the dive boat, and Jerry's on there with some people, and he was just, doing that, just sort of casually scuba diving. And of course the word got out, and everybody's in tie-dye on the boat and stuff. But he couldn't have been more gracious, and spent some time, talked to him.
Wow.
Some environmental stuff. And then there are some videos out there, I think, on the Garcia Band website of that action. There's a picture of me standing next to Jerry on that website, and a younger version of myself. And so it was a fun time. And,
Wow.
they all came over. Wasserman and Weir came and played at the Kauai Dome, the dome over there in Kauai, and we hung out on the beach with him and Taj Mahal till dawn. And there was all kinds. It was a real casual scene over there. So anything that was fun like that happened, we could get connected into it.
Are there any memorable collaborations between you and any local artists?
One of the things about having larger bands is that that gives a bigger stage to the local bands that play before them, right? And so a lot of people always ask me, why are we booking these bigger bands, and why are you doing this stuff? And part of it is, hey, it's in our DNA to make the party larger. That's just part of what we do, the beer business. But it also gives, I like to see the local bands on the big stage with the big sound and the professional stuff that goes on, and giving younger people, younger bands, that opportunity is also something I find enjoyable, right? And seeing people get up there for the first time with a real PA and real sound equipment, and you're just like, wow. You can always see that in their faces, like, oh my gosh, because it's not easy to do. It's not something that musicians get to do on a regular basis, right? You play where you play, and so that aspect of it, sort of that's a collaboration in its own way, right? It's sort of just trying to build it bigger so that you bring from the bottom up, you bring them also. It's not just the headliner bill that's part of the project. The rest of it matters to me just as much.
What a beautiful thing that is. And as far as I think we're going to put the links to the live schedule in the podcast. Sure. So folks who want to know what's happening and want to see some of the bands maybe we're talking about, or if they're enticed to learn more about what you guys got going on over there, it'll all be in the description. Switching gears a little bit. So in 2014, right, Bluepoint was sold to Anheuser-Busch InBev, right? And certainly at that point, I think, the idea of a corporate mentality taking over, it would not have been surprising at all if a lot of this Bluepoint support for local music, the local music scene and community, might have been lost in that transition. And I know you have an active role in there. How did you manage to not let that happen with the corporate entity? And we're all very aware of how corporations work. And sometimes, you have somebody who is not in the community looking at an expenditure on a spreadsheet and what is this for, and questioning it, I would imagine. How did you manage to not let that happen? I'm
Well,
very curious
you
about that.
can't show them the spreadsheets. I mean, that's the first step. But no, in all seriousness, there was a lot more autonomy at Blue Point and has been, for the 10 years of the ABI time frame. There was a lot more autonomy than people would think, and I think that's ultimately what the answer is that we controlled our own destiny a lot more. We had to work within the system for, on the business side of things, on the beer business side of things, but there wasn't anybody to tell us not to do anything. We controlled our budgeting and our marketing stuff, and everything that always did. And that was a big focus for them, was just keep doing what you're doing. They didn't really want it to stop what we were doing. They wanted to amplify what we were doing. And that is, that's not a complicated thing, but people, the idea of a big company, there's a lot of negative connotation with that. And I'm not a big company apologist. Trust me, the wars I had in the last 10 years, they go on forever. But as far as the music came, they that was something we did, and they knew they weren't experts at. The only, when you look at a company like Anheuser-Busch, they book bands like Bud Light things that are just gigantic events across the country, and they use outside agencies and figure that all out. They're not doing that because they're doing that to sell beer, and somebody told them that this is a popular act and they went and did it. Then it's a different kind of level of endorsement. Whereas we're doing it for all the reasons we've previously discussed. And that's so far out of their sphere that there wasn't anybody to tell us not to, I think, is when it really comes down to.
Right. So similar to when Blue Point first started out, you mentioned town of Patchogue, not really knowing what's going on. No one told you not to do something. So there was a certain freedom. And this is maybe a different version of that.
The whole concept of asking forgiveness instead of permission has been a thread through Blue Point forever. And when you manufacture alcohol and throw parties like we throw, there's always going to be slight collateral damage. I mean, you try to do the best you can, but things happen in live performances and music and noise and crowds. And as much as we tried to always create an atmosphere that was friendly and trouble-free, every once in a while something happens. And so you have to deal with it. And you just have to be able to manage your way through that with whoever might be in charge, whether it was the municipality or the company or whoever else. We had a lifetime of trying to work that out, and a lifetime of experience of asking forgiveness. And so I think that's played well with my experience with the big companies.
Right. Well, that leads me to my next question, which is, now being that Blue Point was just sold to Tilray, right? I imagine things are in a bit of a transitional state at the moment. Any idea on what you just mentioned? We think it'll still continue? Will there still be that autonomy you'll have, any thoughts on that, or do you have any indication of that at this point, or is that still unfolding?
I would say, to be honest, I think it's still unfolding. I mean, one of the things that, as far as this podcast goes, we have an event we do 420, April 20th every year, and we have bands at those events. And you have to sort of get that all set September, October because the bands book up bigger bands, and so that was right at transition time for the company. So we weren't able to do our normal thing, but they're known. They own a brand called Sweetwater Brewing down in Atlanta, and they do huge shows. I mean, huge shows down there. And so they're very much in touch with what the live music thing is. And their direction to us once the dust settled was, go bigger and more often. So that's we're trying to work through all that now and what that really means. And so we're looking forward to sort of, the term bringing it to the next level is a little overused, but sort of getting the most out of our space there that we can. So that's, things are pointing towards live music. So we'll hope for the best.
Yeah. Well, with you at the helm, I'm sure you'll be an advocate for it, which, as far as your own role, though, moving forward, do you have any idea? Will your role be similar, you think, to what it's been?
Yeah. In transition is really it. It's it was a big thing that they did when they tripled the size of their business by buying those brands from Anheuser-Busch. So it's only been a few weeks, so they're really just trying to figure out who and what they have. And we're still getting to know people. It's too early. I mean,
Yeah.
they may be sick of me or may not buy into my act, but that's their right. That's their prerogative, or they may. So time will tell.
Yeah. And, I think, right. But one thing's clear that your role from the beginning to where it is in the community, I would think that that has to register a little bit on the meter, certainly. My experience with you and the people I talk to about you, you just have cultivated just a positive when people see you. And I think you walk into a room, I think it affects people in a positive way. So I would imagine that, I wouldn't be surprised if your role continues, but I can understand in the world we live in, you just don't know. One day at a time, I guess.
Yeah, right now it's one day at a time. And that's kind of you to say that. We'll see what tomorrow brings. But at this point in my life, I'm not going to, I'm not looking to just, sort of answer to somebody just for the sake of doing it. I'm fortunate that I can say that and mean it, because those days are behind me. If they don't like the way I do things or the way the things I want to emphasize, or, on the beer side, create the things I want to create and want to show them why I'm doing different things. If that's not in their plan, then that's not in their plan. And, off to the next venture is the way, or adventure really at this point.
As I mentioned earlier, one thing I like is like tracing things back to the inception of things. And I think people see a successful business and oftentimes don't realize, the challenges that were faced early on. And it was funny. I did watch an old interview of you, and in the interview you said, we basically emptied our bank accounts, mortgaged our houses, and jumped off a cliff. And so far we haven't hit the bottom yet, and I think tying it back to musicians, I think if you're a musician, there's this vulnerability, you're putting it all out there, and you're investing in money and gear and records. Is anyone going to listen to me? And requires a certain level of, you mentioned music being your church, a certain level of faith, whatever that faith might be.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, can you think of a significant challenge you encountered in your process and how you overcame it,
Sure. I mean, one of the big pieces of what we did, we're trying to brew beer, right? So we're in one aspect, we're manufacturers, right? I mean, we're basically beer manufacturers, we're brewing. And what happens if you sell, in the simplest terms, if you sell some beer, you got to make more. And if you sell more than you can make, then you have to buy more equipment to make more beer, to sell more beer. And you end up in this sort of search for capital situation where it's always, you're growing, but you're like, oh, we need more. Every time we sell beer, we need to buy more equipment. And that's a very hard dynamic to get out of when you're a small manufacturer, because if you, as you go along, every penny that you're bootstrapping has to go back to the business. And I see that with musicians all the time. I mean, all the time do I see the exact same thing happen. And I try to tell them to hang in there. And there's, that if there is no magic answer unless you create enough capital to get out of that, where you built a place like we have in Patchogue or whatnot, and you get out of that sort of stair step thing where you sell more, you got to buy more equipment. And that's sort of a quandary of small manufacturing. And that trying to get our way through that, if you think about the early 2000s, we had sort of maxed out the capacity in the River Avenue location, and we were trying to figure out next steps. And one of the things we did in the interim was we had beer made at other breweries for us. It's called contract brewing, right? It's done in every business. And we started doing that because it was easier and faster, and the quality was good for us to do that, have beer made at larger facilities that had better equipment than we did. So the quality of the beer was spot on, than it would have been for us to rent another place in Long Island and grow the facility or move those things on Long Island with manufacturing extraordinarily difficult, more difficult. And I was looking at the brands that we were competing with, and they're all in fairly rural spots. They can just put up another building if they want. We had a lot of challenges on Long Island that you don't see other places. And so we did that. We went that contract brewing route where we brought in bottles from other places, and that allowed us to grow rapidly because I could get the volume to the wholesalers. I could get the beer where it was requested by the customers, and we didn't have to build the brewery every step of the way to get there. And that was, at the time, not as popular a avenue to take in our business, but it was an avenue I felt we had to do because we weren't going to be able to deal with the real estate, and we didn't have that kind of cash. We weren't funded in any way. We were just, trying to figure it out as we went. So that sort of, decision to utilize contract brewing, and you have to give up a little control, but you able to grow your business much more rapidly. And I think that's one answer to how we got rolling in the early 2000s so quickly.
Right. And speaking of beer, I do have one beer question, because I guess what prompted me to ask you to interview you today was, we were playing, I think it was with the Falco brothers backstage, and you were kind of holding court, when someone asked you a question, they said, like, how does a brand, like Blue Point or Heineken keep a consistency of taste in their product over years and years, being that, it's not like Coca-Cola where it's made by these like chemicals or some like easily repeated things. You're dealing with natural things that have seasons and natural ingredients. So I know someone asked you that, and I was fascinated. So maybe you could tell some of the folks listening at home, and maybe in your own words, like how does brands keep this consistency of brand, of taste for years and years and years with a product?
Yeah, it's I think one of the things that is lost in translation often when we talk about beer is the fact that beer is at its heart an agricultural product. And I think that's, if people understood that more, they might even have more respect for it. But so things like barley and hops, barley is the body and sweetness of the beer, hops being the spice of the beer. Those things are all grown, and they have to, and the agricultural challenges are tremendous that these products get under, because you're asking somebody to grow something that doesn't change, that its properties doesn't change at, because you want it to be the same every year. And as science evolves, we find that that's helped a lot. Now, I'll give an example, a funny example. Like hops are grown in the 49 along the 49th parallel in North America, right on in Washington, Yakima Valley, all go across the country. And then when you go around the world, in Michigan, New York, and when you go into England and Germany, those are all hop growing regions, and that's why those are beer drinking countries. And so when first started with Anheuser-Busch, I was put on this hop traveling team, and we went around the world, and we tried to find different hops that were growing that we could bring back to America and use, right? And so on one of these trips, I'm in South Africa, and we're looking at the hop fields in South Africa, and one of the challenges is that the South Africa is so close to the Arctic, the South Pole, that there's only 8 hours of growing light in a day instead of 12 like we get up here. And so since the 70s, they've been training these plants to grow in 8 hours. And for that, they have different characteristics and different flavors. And so when you're trying to match all of these things, right, different growing regions, different political climate, when I look at the sophisticated hop fields in North America, I stand there at Elk Mountain, which is that little piece of Idaho that touches Canada. It's 10 miles from it. Beautiful place. They have drones with infrared light that look at the plants because you can see the disease before the naked eye. And the grounds all have sensors for different pests and for obviously for moisture. And then we go down there, and it's a whole different story, right? Those fields they're growing hops, but they're not using that kind of technology, and they're not using that kind of repeatability. And instead of machinery harvesting, it's people in pickup trucks and machetes, and you just have this whole different view of it. And you're saying, wow, when you think what we do when we're used to the farming side of it, we have to teach these people, and they have to bring them onto that that side. And so all of those changes, you don't want to affect the beer at the end of the day, right? You want the beer to be the same. And so the brewers, that's at the end of the day, that's one of the biggest thing brewers have to do is evaluate the raw material and the plants and the barley. And there's lots of options, hundreds of hops. There's not as many barley options, but they're certainly there. And they change. When you think about barley is harvested once a year, just like most things, and it has to wait till the next year. So that barley you're brewing with in August got harvested in September or October the previous year. And so you have to hope that it lasts well and it still has its characteristics as if it was just harvested fresh. And there's a lot of technology that goes into that, but it still changes. And there's technical reports you get on each batch of raw material so that, the brewer can make adjustments. But ultimately, Mother Nature's in control of these things, and you have to be able to understand that, and you have to know. I mean, one of the interesting things in hops is a bunch of different types. Cascade is one of the best known ones. They're finding now that different hop plants are more similar that are grown next to each other than the same ones that are grown in different locations, right? So it's more about the ground and the conditions than it necessarily is even about the hop type. So the ones with different names end up being more similar because they're grown in the same conditions. Similar to what wine and terroir is, that whole concept is coming to beer raw materials now, right? So I find that absolutely fascinating. I think that we have this chance to develop a real respect for the agricultural side of the business as people get used to that. But that was never it. You bought the type of hops, whether it was grown one place or another. That wasn't the concern. And so as we learn more, like anything else, beer is a journey. The science changes. We learn more. I love the fact that the agricultural piece is so interesting.
All right. We're going to take another pause right here. We'll be right back with the Long Island Sound Podcast.
The Long Island Sound is here to help you connect with local artists. Follow us on Instagram for the latest up-to-date podcast episodes and also to connect with your local artists and their upcoming shows.
Welcome back to the Long Island Sound Podcast. So Mark, what's next for you? Like as far as your own legacy, what do you hope to, leave behind, both professionally and personally? What would you.
All right. The sounds like the end of the line here, but
not quite. I got one more question, but I was thinking about all that you've accomplished, and again, the focus of most of what we talked about today is in regard to your community aspect and the difference you've made in musicians' lives. But I just, I think in my own life lately, I've been finding, just like, my own legacy. So I guess in friends of ours, it's been a topic of conversation that's come up with some friends of mine. So I figured I'd throw it out there to you, and you can answer it any way you want, as far as that. But any thoughts on that?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I haven't really thought that much about it, but because to me it's an endless journey that I'm on. The music and the beer journey is something that even if I was to leave Bluepoint, for instance, then I'm in the sort of the mentor. There's a lot of small breweries that could use some help from somebody with experience, or even just, it doesn't have to be all that a professional relationship, but visiting and talking to people about beer and how to make things better. I think when I leave behind, I really just want people to have had a good time with us and had a positive experience at Blue Point and a place where they felt comfortable, right? I think that's one of the big things that we've always tried to have at the location. And, on the beer side, I want everybody to say, hey, the beer was always good, right? I mean, that's as simple as that, right? They made stuff out of thin air. We created things out of thin air, and we made stuff that was good, and we were professional in our production side so that we made good beer. But on the sort of the music and the venue side and the bar, I really wanted to be. That's what the whole thing is about, being comfortable. The world's a tough place. It's a stressful place. Crazy shit goes on. When you show up at Blue Point, that stuff's not on the table, Our job is to take you away from that and as much as we can. And our job is to be happy and smiling every time you show up. I mean, we got, stuff in our lives too, everybody, but you show up at our place and, like I tell people, if if you don't have a good time at Blue Point, it's not our fault. That's my goal, right? My goal is that you show up and if something goes wrong, you're not having a good time. Everybody has stuff in their life. I don't want it to be our fault, right? And that's it's just not that complicated, but it's the respect for the customer, right? Make sure people have space. You're not pushing people out. You're not rude to people. Don't be an asshole. It's just real simple rules, right? Be treated like you'd want to. Like we've all gone to venues and places where it was just hectic and too busy and not or whatever. It didn't work out. I'm just saying the things that we control them, and we just treat people the way you want to be treated. We all go to places. We're all in this lifestyle. So what's the best thing we saw? Let's just do it. And that ultimately is what is right for folks, not whatever rule you want to make, not anything. Just make people comfortable. They're here to get away from the stuff that you see on the news. That's not us. We don't even have TVs at the brewery. We never have, right? And that's part of it. People always like what? Why aren't the game isn't on? I'm like, nah, we're not that place, right? But it's also keep you away from all the other stuff that's coming on the TV besides just the momentary sports thing. And that's what we want people to do. It's a place where you talk to other people, a place you listen to music, enjoy food and beer. That's what it really is. And that's part of that what I want to leave behind. And part of that is that there is a way to do this but with treating people better. And I think that's a big focus of what I think about.
Yeah, I think you've achieved that, Mark. You had mentioned the idea of like helping maybe an up and coming brewery that might need your expertise. Have you been involved in mentoring? Is that something you have aspirations to do? The idea of mentoring somebody that maybe even I saw maybe it was on your Twitter account when I was doing some research for this. You shared something about a new brewery opening up on Long Island, and you said welcome to the person, and so obviously that's in your nature, and giving back to the community is obviously, as we've talked about extensively. Can you see yourself mentoring?
I can easily. It's part of what craft beer was. So when I started 70s and 80s, there wasn't any schooling for craft beer, and there wasn't any stuff in the libraries, right? It was it's a little bit of a story, but when they repealed Prohibition in 1933, they left the word beer out of it. So it was illegal to make beer at home until 1978. Jimmy Carter changed that, right? They had wine in there. You could always make wine at home. But what happened because of that is it was illegal. It was like contraband. So there were no books in the library. There was no way to get information, right? The brewmasters were all from overseas universities. We didn't have any schooling in the U.S. And so there's this term that said that craft beer is the first successful open source endeavor by mankind, right? So a lot of words, but I lived that, right? And so like in the early 80s when I was out in California, I'd be in San Diego, we were home brewing, craft beer thing was just starting. Say there was a Dead Show in Frisco, we would leave on Fridays and go up the coast and stop at every brewery. And I would, lo and behold, we're talking to the brewers, and then next thing you know, we're in the back drinking beer, and I'm sharing everything that I learned. They're sharing with them, and you spend the whole day, sleep on somebody's floor, get up and go do it, go north till you get up for the show, and then turn around and come back and do the exact same thing. And so you got to meet everybody in the industry, but that was how information was exchanged, right? There was no other way to get it. And so that sort of open source piece is endemic to what I feel. So we're always always willing to help people. We have a very sophisticated brewing lab at Bluepoint. People are welcome to give us samples, and we'll run them confidentially for good or for ill. And just anything I can do for general help. That the way I got into the business was sharing knowledge and having people share with me, and I'll certainly go out the same way.
Yeah, that's really beautiful to hear that. And I can't help but think a lot of similarities between musicians sharing creative ideas and sleeping on couches and floors and things like that. Yeah. One last question, Mark, for any aspiring like entrepreneurs or artists listening to to this podcast today. Might you have any words of inspiration or encouragement that you'd like to share based on your experiences and journey with them that you think might be helpful?
You got to stick to it, right? I mean, that's the end of the day. If you believe in it and you want to do it, it's you got to stick to it. There's just nothing's easy, right? Everybody wants, you see Taylor Swift on TV and you think it's a piece of cake, but the challenges that I've seen artists go through and musicians in particular, that those challenges are about as big as anybody I've seen in business do anything. And so, but if it's your passion, at the end of the day, you're so much better off following your passion than you are following somebody else's passion. And so that I think is as simple as it is to me. That's how I look at it, right? I'm like, if that's your passion, no matter how it works out, at the end, it's not transactional. It's not about the end. It's about every day. And if you follow your passion every day, you have played the game. You're doing it. That's what you're doing. There's nothing else. It does. If there's more money in the bank at the end of the day, that's good for you. But that's not it. It's being in it, following your passion is it. That's it. And so to me it is anyway. I'm sorry. But that's my sort of advice is as hard as it gets and as difficult as it is, just follow your passion.
On that note, Mark, I'd like to thank you for doing this podcast. And I think folks are going to really enjoy listening to this. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and in this format. And thank you for being part of my maiden voyage of being a podcast host. So hopefully I did you well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and appreciate it. Always appreciate seeing you and talking to you and spending time. This is wonderful because it's usually really loud when we're talking, but this is a nice change from that. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing with the podcast.
Hey, that concludes our special episode with Mark Burford of Blue Point Brewery. And I want to say a special thanks to a really great guy, Chris Marshak, on his maiden voyage as a guest host on the Long Island Sound podcast. I'm so excited about the direction we're going in and the insights that we're getting, not only from the artists, but also from now a venue owner who has been very successful and really supports live music, original music, and building community, because that's what we're all about here at the Long Island Sound. Okay, till next time, take care. Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate the time you spent with us. Please subscribe and comment and visit us at gigdestiny.com. Till next time, be generous with your joy, keep your spirits high, and let the music take you on a journey. Be well. Peace.